What's up, guys? I'm going to talk about this topic, which is why I don't consider myself a feminist, right? Now, this is kind of strange, especially somebody who is both a social scientist and someone who is a Christian, right? So, I mean, my field is sociology. And many sociologists, I'm not sure if it's like the majority of them, uh, can consider themselves feminists, especially if they are female sociologists. Um, and so this is kind of like a controversial topic, I guess you can call it. But a lot of people don't really understand why some people refuse to call themselves feminists, right? So, in other words, they will ask you questions such as, excuse me, they're going to ask you questions such as, well, don't you believe in the equality of the sexes? Are you saying that men and women are not equal and stuff like that? Because in today's society, we are so used to pointing fingers and accusing that we fail to understand that there is nuance to all those topics, or pretty much all of them. Maybe some things are really black and white, but when it comes to social and political issues like this one, it's very difficult to take a radical stance and say that only one position is correct and everybody else is wrong, because that is a very difficult position to sustain. It's actually not even a wise one to maintain, right? It's one thing to claim that you are of a particular ideology, but it's definitely not wise to assume that your ideology is the only correct one, and by contradistinction, every other ideology is the wrong one. And so, anyways, I just kind of wanted to explain some background information before I really get started. So, why don't I consider myself a feminist? Do I not believe in the equality of men and women? Well, certainly I do. I definitely do believe in the equality of men and women. I think they are both inherently equal, made, again, this is a dirty word in today's academy, and even in today's culture, actually. They are both made equal in the eyes of God. And so, what that means is God has created us equally. We have different roles, but we are both equal. We complement one another. Now, a lot of people, especially in the social sciences, but I'm going to stick more to my field, sociology. I don't want to speak for others like psychology, even though psychology and sociology are very close to each other. But I don't want to make assumptions about those other fields. What I will talk about is sociology, my own field. A lot of these gender roles are, and gender norms are assumed to be purely socially constructed. And while there might be some sort of hint at, yeah, like we do acknowledge biological differences, but really that acknowledgement is very superficial and it's very shallow. And it's oftentimes mentioned as a sort of like it's only external, it's only skin deep. So there isn't really much of a belief in biological differences when it comes to behavior that determine oftentimes the behavior between men and women. And this is, especially true at the neurological level, which manifests itself obviously in a person's behavior and thought patterns. So, the feminists in the sociological camp are extremely radicalized, and they like to believe that, you know, that men and women are not actually different at all whatsoever. We are simply products of our environment. And again, if you tell that to a feminist sociologist, especially if she is a female, but also the same thing with a male, although to a lesser extent, they become very defensive and they start to push back against that, and they start to accuse you of being what is called a biological reductionist, right? So, what does biological reductionist mean? A biological reductionist means somebody who believes that all of our behaviors, everything that is true about human nature, is reduced to biology. Psychology doesn't play any role, and if it does, it plays a minor role. So whether it's psychology, sociology, culture, those things are not important at all, or they're not that important. They contribute maybe 10% to the discussion of gender differences, but they certainly don't play a major role. But in reality, it's more complicated than that, right? So we've all heard the phrase of nature versus nurture, right? So that means that there is a combination of both nature and nurture that determine and influence our behavior. So, of course, while it is actually true that our just because we are wired differently, it doesn't mean that we have to act in that way. But it does not mean that therefore we are blank slates. That's not actually true. Um, but on the other hand, it is not true to say that, you know, we are, obviously I mentioned that right now. It doesn't make sense to say that we are only shaped by our environment, that, biology doesn't have any say in it. So I'm not really sure why so many people are so polarized on this issue. And the hidden assumption here is that only one side has the truth and the other side is misguided. And that's, again, that's not how it is. That's not how it works, guys. So, and so, how does that tie into me not being a feminist? Well, it's because feminists often think that way, right? The feminist movement in the 60s and in the 70s was a more noble and respectable movement. The feminism of today is neither noble nor respectable, and it would be immoral for me. It would be at the least unethical for me to consider myself a feminist, and especially if I am a Christian, because being a feminist today would require me to cast my moral compass and to ignore the scientific evidence in favor of making women feel better. Now, there's nothing wrong, obviously, with women feeling better and feeling empowered. I think that's a good thing that there are more and more opportunities for women today. Not that, men have had all the opportunities and women are just barely catching up to date. That's not actually how it works. Again, that's another very, 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 very simplistic view of reality. The assumption that we're given is that men have always had all the privilege and women didn't, and we're just barely catching up. See, that view is very simplistic and it's actually not accurate, because what they're talking about here is upper class men and women. But that wasn't true of everybody else. So, in other words, the 99 percenters were pretty much equal, but their equality was equality of misery, right? The battle here between the sexes happened mostly, or even like almost exclusively, in upper class families, right? So that's really where the oppression happened. It happened in the top 1% of income percentile families. And so everybody else had a hard life, whether you were a man or a woman. And so it is not true that all men had this privilege. It's only true that 1% of men had this privilege. And so that's another reason why I don't consider myself a feminist. And also, I think it's very concerning that we have to, politicize this issue. Um, Believing that men and women are equal is a common sense idea. It's even actually much more deeper than that. It is a divine idea that is implanted in us by God Himself, because that is what the scriptures say about the genders, right? They say that men and women are equal. They have different roles, but nonetheless, they are equal. So one doesn't need to create an ideology that supports that idea, right? There's no need for a separate ideology that says that, oh, men and women are equal, because the assumption is that people don't know that or they don't believe that. And so we have to educate them on that topic when in reality, pretty much everybody knows that. And so let me give you an example. Let's just say that I am advocating that, you know, trying to come up with an example here. Let's just say the races, right? Um, that they are all equal. Well, why do we need to constantly remind everybody that the races are equal, right? It's because the people who are doing that benefit from doing that financially, politically, economically, socially, all the above, academically, professionally, right? They actually don't really care. They don't even give a damn if you believe it or if you don't. That's not necessarily the issue. The issue is conformity with their ideological framework. So, what does that mean? That means that if you agree with them 100%, then you are somehow noble. But tomorrow they can just as easily change that ideology and claim something different. And they can say men and women are not equal. And if you don't believe that, then you are backwards and you are uneducated and so on and so forth, right? So we all know that men and women are equal. We don't have to advocate for that just as much as we don't have to advocate that when it's cloudy outside, it's going to rain, right? So people know that, they can observe that, right? This is not the first century AD where people didn't have a sophisticated idea of gender dynamics. Although I would highly dispute that as well. The assumption is also that somehow today we are much more intelligent when it comes to these things than people of the past, and that people of the past really were backwards and socially inept and unkempt when it comes to these topics. That's actually not true. Yes, we have advanced and we have more information today, but a lot of these things that happened in the past happened because of lack of awareness. They didn't happen because of animus. Animus only played a very small part of it. It did not play the main role, and so, but feminism advocates that history can be defined as primarily through a Marxist lens, obviously, as a battleground between men and women. That's not how history is defined. History is not defined as a battleground between men and women. That's actually not how. There's no evidence to prove that. This is simply conjecture, and they are trying to find evidence to prove that conjecture. That's not how science works. Science works the reverse. You do start off with a conjecture, right? But then so that's your hypothesis that history is a battleground between men and women, right? Then you construct an experiment, you collect data, and then there is the null hypothesis, which is there is no battleground between men and women, and then there's the alternate hypothesis. So these are like scientific terms, obviously, um, which is there is a battleground between men and women. And there's no evidence to prove the alternate hypothesis. There's hundreds of thousands of evidence to prove that men and women are treated equally and fairly, and that there's no conspiracy that is created to keep women down and lift men up solely based on their gender. There's so much that goes into it, and if there is any gender discrimination, it's very peripheral, and it actually doesn't happen as often as people want you to think that it is. Because every time it does happen, especially when the discrimination is against women, the media is not even hesitant to publicize it. what we're seeing today is the opposite. What we're seeing is men getting discriminated against at the systematic level, and everybody else being mute about it. And we are telling men to accept it because somehow we have always enjoyed this privilege. And I oftentimes wonder, what privilege do I have as a man that I enjoy that you as a woman don't enjoy? And my opponents never ever, almost never ever have any response to that. Their only well, they do have response to that. Their only response is you're a sexist. Their only response is you're a misogynist and you must hate women. You're sexually frustrated. You have this issue and that issue. And so when you encounter such weak and strong man arguments, it's hard to take it seriously because the entire edifice of modern feminism is built on sentimentalism and victimhood. Women are not victims, just like men are also not victims. For the most part, although I would argue that men today are slightly more victimized because of modern day feminism. Um, and so that is why I don't consider myself to be a feminist, because I do believe in the equality of men and women, right? But I don't consider myself a feminist because there's no need for me to have an ideology about that. That belief does not originate from feminism. It originates from God. And God himself God doesn't think of himself as a feminist because he's holy and he's perfect and he knows what he's talking about. And us fallible humans don't know what we're talking about. So it's better to listen to what he says instead of listening to what your professor says or what you yourself say. So a dose of humility, many doses of humility are necessary for feminists, because male and female feminists today are arrogant and they think that they can recreate reality into however they want. And in reality, it's like you don't get to choose that. You can only experience reality and observe it and adapt to it, and that's it. But you can't make false claims of victimhood, because women today are not victimized, right? And they have equal opportunity, and that's a good thing. And if you can't accept that and you claim that somehow discrimination continues today and nothing has changed, then you are a liar and you are a fool. And all I can say is God help you. And I would encourage you to observe reality and balance that with what the scientific evidence says. But if you want to be dishonest, then of course you are definitely allowed to call yourself a feminist. Because one last reason why I don't call myself a feminist is because I prefer to focus on the truth. Whereas feminists, for the most part, modern feminists prefer to focus on lies. And that's ultimately why I don't consider myself a feminist. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care.